All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started now. Good afternoon. My name is Joey, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program. The Dole Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students committed to the work of the Dole Institute. We attend regular meetings, assist in events just like this one, and plan an SAB-sponsored program every semester. Members of the SAB receive great opportunities to network with our special guests. If you're a student and would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. If you would like to know a little bit more about supporting the SAB and other Dole Institute activities, please contact our development coordinator, Clarissa Unger. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you. If you enjoyed today's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. Your attendance and feedback help shape future programming. To view past programs, visit our online video archive at www.doleinstitute.org. A video of today's presentation will be available on our website soon. Before we begin today, I would like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the presentation, we will have some time for audience question and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I will come by with a microphone. It's very important that you wait until I bring the microphone for our audio, for our video. Please ask just one brief question. If at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers and they can assist you. So please welcome Dr. Wilbanks, the director of the CGSC's Department of History, Military History.
Let me just welcome you to the 8th in our series of 10 presentations on decisive battles. Today, our presenter will be John Suprin. John, like many of us in the department, are retired Army officers, and like most of the people in the department who are retired Army officers except me, is a former armor officer, a tanker. Well, I try not to hold that against him or the rest of the guys in the department. He also was a foreign area officer, which means that he received a special education having to do with the Soviet Union, its armed forces, and those of the now defunct Warsaw Pact. And his expertise has become back into vogue, as you might suspect. So without further ado, John.
So it's a pleasure to be back here at the Dole Institute. I've been here a couple of times and haven't gummed it up badly enough to be disinvited. So I'll try to keep that going for today. So the subject for this hour's worth of presentation and question and answer is going to be the Battle of Moscow in 1941. For those of you that need a little ramp up, there will be a little ramp up that'll take you from the beginning of the Russo-German War in June of 1941 up through the Battle of Moscow, which happens in the late autumn, early winter of 1941. What I'm going to do is I've got a series of PowerPoint slides, and there's like 34 of them. And what I found in the past is you really have to rush to get through 34 slides. So I'm going to kind of play it by ear and see what I'm going to fast forward through. I want to talk you through what I consider the most important parts of this. Perhaps one of the most interesting things is you've got this city, which is a city, in 1941, it's a city of 4 million people. And you've got an invading army, German and Allied invading army of less than 3 million spread all over the Soviet Union. And you think about the logistics of taking on a target that has 4 million indigenous inhabitants as well as a defending armed forces, and you think, isn't that kind of a big job? And the answer is yes, it's probably too big of a job. So one of the things that you have to know up front is that the German army, Adolf Hitler, the chief of the German General Staff, never envisioned a house-to-house, street-to-street fight in Moscow. What they envisioned was ultimately to encircle the city, and then once it was encircled, to allow famine and disease to do its magic, to destroy the population internally without the use of armed forces. Armed forces were going to be used primarily to seal it off from outside assistance and to cause it to kill itself. So with that happy thought, we'll get underway. Let's see if we can advance this. Okay, so here we go. What I'm going to do is, this is a little bit of a chronology of what I'll talk about today. So we'll talk a little bit about the invasion, the beginning of the war from June to August, where you see a lot of German tactical and operational success, a lot of catastrophe for the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union's armed forces. Then a kind of a break in the action where the Germans decide that they're going to do more than one thing at one time, which always works out the same way, right? When you try to do more than one thing at one time, frequently you lose focus, and that's what the Germans do. For about a month, they lose focus, and then come back to the target in the autumn of 1941, a focus on Moscow. The way I'm going to run this through is there are certain weather conditions that happen in Russia that are worth noting. There's a season of mud called the Rasputitsa, the roadless season, and that matters when you're trying to fight a war with a mechanized army. And you're trying to do logistics for a mechanized army. If you lose the roads, if you lose the ability to use roads, both your logistical capability and your maneuver capability are rapidly degraded. And if your enemy is being pushed up against his own infrastructure, you know, the best infrastructure in the Soviet Union, where do you think it might be? In the 100 miles around Moscow. So the Soviets are actually being pushed, what's left of them, back towards the very best part of their infrastructural, setup in the whole country. Their logistics are there, their production is there, their population is there, while the Germans stretch themselves further and further and further away from their lines of supply, sources of supply, over some pretty miserable roads. So we'll talk about the roadless period, we'll talk about the freeze, because it gets cold in Russia, and that matters. And one of the biggest reasons it matters is because the Germans didn't plan to fight in the winter in Russia. They planned for the war to be over by that time. So there's a problem when you're needing things like winter clothing, and you actually haven't planned to need winter clothing while the fight was going on. You assume that by the time you needed a coat, the shooting would be done, and so you could ship coats to guys that needed them, but you wouldn't have to do things like ship ammo, medicine, food to soldiers that were still fighting. So that was a mistake. The bookend, the end here, is going to be the Soviet counteroffensive. The Soviets are going to launch a counteroffensive in the beginning of December. Effectively, that ends the German offensive. Effectively, that ends the Battle of Moscow. I will not go into any depth on the Soviet counteroffensive other than kind of tell you the broad picture of kind of how it happens, when it happens, and what it does to the Germans, but we won't go into that. So, questions before I proceed?
About the railroads were different in Russia than they were in the rest of Europe.
Yeah, there's a railroad gauge difference. So when you go in from European Russia, so from Poland, middle of Poland, and you start heading down what is actually the best road and rail network, the best road and rail network going east that the Germans have when they invade is between Warsaw and Moscow, that direct line between the two. That's where the best quality roads are, the highest density of roads and the highest density of rails. Russian rail gauge is different. It's wider by about 8 to 10 inches, which doesn't seem like a lot, but what it means is you have to relay all of the track if you're going to use German locomotives. And so there's an assumption that you're going to capture a lot of Soviet locomotives and use them because they're already wide gauge capable. Well, when you don't capture them, there's a problem, and then you have to regauge. It's not terribly hard to do, but it's just another logistical nightmare added on top of all these other logistical nightmares. And even when you fix it, one of the interesting differences between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, between Russia and a place like France, is the density of roads and rails is much different. There's a whole bunch of nothing in Russia where there ain't no road and there ain't no rail. And in a place like France, those things are pretty close together. So once you get off of a rail car in Russia and you have, a ton of supplies that's going to a unit, a military unit, how far does that thing have to travel? Generally speaking, it's a long way compared to a place like France. How's it going to get there? Okay, on a horse cart, maybe? On a truck, maybe? What kind of roads will that thing travel on? Bad ones. And if you have vehicles traveling long distances on bad roads, what happens to their survivability, serviceability rate? It goes right through the floor. And one of the things that the Germans did is because they campaigned in Western Europe earlier, they had kind of lost sight of all of these potential fiascos that were nesting in each other, waiting to happen in serial, in sequence. Okay, so I put a slide up here, and the slide I was told not to walk on this side, so I'll walk over here. But the slide, if you can read it, kind of tells what the basic German plan was for the destruction of the Soviet Union and the Red Army. So instrumentally, what they're trying to do is they're trying to destroy the Red Army. Where it is they're trying to destroy it as close to the border as they can, because the German army knows where their enemy is, and they know how big it is. And so what they want to do is they want to capture it, surround it, and kill it before it can escape. So they don't want to push it east. They want to surround it and kill it. And then they want to shock the Soviet Union with such tremendous losses all at once that the will to continue to fight evaporates. And of course, if you think about Joseph Stalin and what a kind, gentle gentleman he was, the Germans make an assumption that nobody would actually want to go to war on his behalf. So if you destroyed enough Soviet capability, nobody's going to want to play the game anymore. And that was a bad assumption. Not that Stalin was a bad guy, because he was, but that the Soviets would not be able to take those losses and continue with a will to resist. So that was a German planning error. And it's not a planning error that other people don't make too. You know, the idea that when you kick somebody hard, they're going to quit, that's always an assumption. And if they don't quit, then you're in a circumstance that you didn't forecast. So anyway, the point is, catch them quick, kill them quick, and be done with it. And the Germans planned for this operation to take between 8 and 10 weeks, starting at the end of June. And so by the time the leaves start turning colors in the autumn, you're done. You're done. And then your logistical problem is kind of a motoring tour of an occupied country. So whatever you're leaving for occupation forces are going to have to be logistically supported. But because they're not fighting, it's going to be easy to do. And because they're not fighting, you don't have to leave many of them there. So there's an assumption about the duration of the fight that ends up being detrimental to the Germans' ultimate objectives. Okay. I love this delay. It's some statistical stuff for those that like the statistical stuff. So the Germans use about 136 divisions. A division's about 17,000 people, soup to nuts. And they use 136 of these, which is about 80% of their armed forces against the Soviet Union. The rest of the armed forces are on occupation duty in Western Europe. They're training in Germany. They're doing all this other kind of stuff. But this is the main effort. And most of their good troops are here. Almost all of their armor is here. And their force going into Russia is broken up into 3 army groups. Army groups north, center, and south. And that's how many of combat divisions each one of those units have. So north has 30, center has 51. South has 43 plus 14 Romanian divisions. Romanian divisions are really terrible for a bunch of different reasons. One is they're very small. 2 is they're poorly trained. And they don't have the will to fight, the will for the fight that the Germans do. The Germans are doing something because they want to be doing it. The Romanians are more or less dragged into this. And so from the very beginning, those are looked at as limited utility forces. You can't really expect much of them because they're not that good, they're not well equipped, and they don't really have the heart for a really spunky fight. But they're attached to Army Group South, and they're going to fight in the southern part of the Soviet Union. This is the main effort, Army Group Center. For some strange reasons, they're headed to Moscow. Now, most of the armor is there, most of the really good maneuver forces there. Most of Germany's aircraft that are supporting this whole thing are in support of center. And so you've reinforced center, which just happens to be pointed directly at Moscow, which is interesting because although the German army is really interested in going to Moscow, Adolf Hitler really isn't interested in going to Moscow. More on that later. So let's see what we got here. Okay, so Operation Barbarossa, and this is the invasion of the Soviet Union, begins on the 22nd of June, 1941. Although the Soviets have plenty of early warning, they choose not to believe it. Joseph Stalin chooses not to believe it because he's not ready for it. He doesn't want to cause any provocations, and so looking like you're getting ready for a fight can provoke the other guy. Stalin is absolutely not interested in that because he thinks he needs at least another year to be ready for a war with the Germans. And so he's doing everything he can, including ignoring good intelligence information, to hope it just goes away. It doesn't go away. And because his forces are not alerted, even though there are 3 defensive echelons set up in Western Russia, none of them are really ready to fight. They're not in the right places to effectively fight. They're literally told, grab your gun and let's go, when the Germans are already 10, 15, 20 miles into the Soviet Union. And so you can imagine what a mess that is. Soviet mobilization plans are interesting too. Until you're told we're going to war, the Soviet army really didn't have all of its stuff, like trucks and cars and tractors and stuff like that. They were supposed to, in an emergency when there was a war, they were supposed to take that from the civilian side of the economy, bring it over to the military side, and then use it to move themselves around. Well, when you're told, hey, we're at war, what does that mean about your ability to transport yourself with trucks and cars and tractors? The tractors are being used to pull their artillery, by the way. And you haven't got it ready yet, and the Germans are already here. So there's going to be a tremendous problem with the Soviets moving their heavy equipment, moving their logistics, because they actually have not taken all of that transport capability into the Red Army until the war's already begun. This is a picture taken in the first couple of days of the war. It's a Soviet BT, Bysтрый tank, fast tank. It's a really interesting, clever thing. It was fast as heck. It was designed to do exploitation, so it's got good gas mileage. It goes really fast. You can take the tracks off it and run it on its road wheels. The road wheels are motorized. This road wheel here is motorized. And so if you want to run it on a road where tracks are not helpful, tracks are helpful cross country, but if you're using a road network that's there, you can take the tracks off. It can run like a truck. And it's fast as heck. Fast as heck, good gas mileage means what about its armor protection? Okay, it was designed to be an exploitation tank, which means you got to have it relatively light so the armor is flimsy. A lot of the Soviet armor that the Germans bump into at the beginning of the war are designed for special things, and they get used in the non-special way. In other words, things that don't suit them well. So very clever tank, not really useful, but the Soviets have a lot of these. They have literally quite a lot of these. All right, so that's the basic maneuver plan. I think you can see on the graphic the black, north, center, south. Those are the 3 German army groups. Center heads towards Moscow, south towards Kiev, and north through the Baltic states towards Leningrad. And ultimate objective is going to be Leningrad. Ultimate objective here is going to be around Moscow. And ultimate objective here is going to be Kiev. And then these things go to white. And the reason it goes from black to white is the Germans made the assumption that by the time you kind of get to these places where the black lines end, the Soviets quit. And so once they quit, you keep going east, but it's not a fight anymore. It's just kind of a movement. So this is what the strengths look like of the 2 competing sides in 1941. By the way, the divisional thing, when you get into the war, the divisional sizes of the 2 armies are going to skew away from each other a little bit, but at the beginning of the war, a division is really a division. A Soviet division at the beginning of the war is about the same size, about 17,000 guys, as the average German division. So this is okay. This is not one division from one side is a lot different in size than the other. They're about the same. Manpower, 2.9 million versus 2.5 million Germans. Now, there's more than that number in uniform. The Soviets have about 5 million men in uniform. They have about 14.5 million trained reservists that are wearing civilian clothes, but they've already had some basic military training. So when you decide to call them up, it's not like pulling a guy in that's never done anything. He's at least done some basic military training, so he's going to be more usable more quickly than just drafting a civilian that's never been anything but a civilian. But those numbers, the 2.9 million and the 2.5 million on that chart there, are the forces that actually are in contact with each other across the border. So those are the invading German forces going into the Soviet Union and the defending Soviet forces that are going to be directly opposite them. That's what those 2 numbers are. Artillery and mortars, I put a little asterisk there if you're familiar with the difference between the two, and there's a world of difference. A mortar can be a little cheap tube like this that you drop a bomb in the front of. Artillery piece is a much more sophisticated piece of gear. Both of them give you supporting indirect fires. But the Soviets, unfortunately for us, in their statistics, put the two together. So when you're looking at Soviets, they don't separate out how many guns versus how many mortars. They fuse them together. So because I couldn't take that apart, you get that number. It's probably true that the Soviets have more guns, more artillery, and more mortars than the Germans. But I can't tell you how many guns exactly because the Soviets put the numbers together. The tanks are an interesting number. So 5,500 Soviet tanks versus 3,300 German tanks. The number 5,500, the Soviets said we believe that we had about 5,500 medium and heavy tanks that were of good, relatively modern quality. They had a lot of others that were not. So the tank fleet, the Soviet tank fleet, is gigantic. But they said about 5,500 are relatively modern, relatively good, relatively useful. And so that's the number you get. That's why the asterisk is there, because there's a lot more armored vehicles than that, but they say those are too old to really count. Aircraft, once again with the asterisk on the Soviets, the Soviet Air Force in 1941 is bigger than every other Air Force on planet Earth added together. The Soviet Air Force is the biggest Air Force in the world, and everybody else's stuff, all put in one little piggy bank, does not amount to what is in the Red Air Force. That said, they have a lot of old junk. And so what this number is this is what they said their modern aircraft numbers look like. In 1941, 1,540, fighting the Germans in the West with 2,770 aircraft, and then a whole bunch of other junk in the background. Motor vehicles, I have no statistics, and horses, I have no statistics for the Red Army, although both of those things were going to be drawn from the civilian economy at mobilization, so I'm guessing you end up with a large number. But the Germans, because all of their stuff was already in the forces when they crossed the border, 600,000 motor vehicles, 650,000 horses. Okay, so there's a picture for you. All those cool Russian armored cars. So the Red Army's inventory of armored vehicles was over 20,000 armored vehicles. That is larger than the armor fleet of every other country in the world put together. But they themselves viewed a lot of their inventory as old-fashioned. And there's a couple of reasons for that, and I'll give them to you right up front. The Soviet Union had no industrial economy before about 1930, 33, 34. They're just industrializing in 1933, 34 to the point where they can be an industrially competitive country with other countries. One of the first things they decide to do is build their armed forces up. So, hey, we have factories, what should we build? Well, nobody in the world likes them, so maybe we should build guns and stuff like that. And so they do. But because they've never built tanks and artillery and things like that, guess what? They're kind of disappointed with the product. You build some new gear, you don't have any experience with it. Nobody knows how to mechanically maintain anything in the country because they've never had a machine before. And so as a result, the operational readiness rate of these vehicles goes down pretty quick. The mechanics aren't very good, most people aren't very skilled. The spare parts situation is always awful because they like a brand new end item. They don't like the idea of making spare parts. And so what that means is a lot of your fleet, a lot of your armored vehicle fleet's just not usable because it's not ready to go. Hey, if I turn this key, will this thing start? Well, no, because it's Russian, it won't start. And so this is one of the dynamics that you see even with large numbers of vehicles. When Soviet units move around at the beginning of this fight looking for the Germans, they're bleeding vehicles everywhere they go. They're going down the road and there's just a stream of broken down vehicles everywhere. And as soon as a vehicle breaks down, there's no mechanics, there's no spare parts, there's no fuel. It's just dead. It's never going to rise again. So this is a cool picture of a lot of Soviet equipment, and I'm sure that my photograph here gives you more utility than the Soviet Union got out of all those vehicles. Okay, so So, as I said earlier, at the beginning of the campaign, the Germans wanted to surround a lot of Soviet forces and destroy them, and that's what happened. There are a sequence of relatively large battles at the beginning of the war within about 100 miles of the border, and then even deeper past that, where large concentrations of Soviet soldiers who are attempting to hold the ground they're on are surrounded by German mechanized forces and then reduced. So there's large prisoner bags, there's lots of guys getting killed, there's lots of equipment that you can't replace because it was expensive to build that's lost forever. And so there's going to be a period after this where the Soviets are going to have a little bit of a manpower crunch, they're going to have a little bit of an equipment crunch, because a lot of the material they lost in these encirclements was actually decent material. Some of it was junk, but a lot of it was decent, and it's hard to try to replace this, so there's going to be a period where they don't have things. This is a photograph of some Soviet prisoners from the Smolensk encirclement. In August of 1941, 330,000 Soviet soldiers were surrounded at Smolensk and taken prisoner. Over 3,000 armored vehicles were captured, destroyed at Smolensk. Soviet armored vehicles captured and destroyed. The Germans only invade the Soviet Union with 3,000 tanks of their own, and at Smolensk, the Germans destroy or capture 3,000 Soviet armored vehicles. The basic methodology of surrounding Soviet soldiers seems to work well. There are some unforeseen dynamics in the Soviet Union. When the Germans surrounded the Poles, because they did this to the Poles in 1939, they would surround pieces of the Polish army. They did it to the Belgians, they did it to the French, they did it to, well, they tried to do it to the British, but the British were able to get on a boat and leave. Most of those countries, Poland and Western Europe, when you surrounded the forces that were surrounded relatively rapidly decided that the fight was over and they capitulated. And so when you surrounded people, this is the German experience, they don't fight much past that. Yeah, a little bit, little wiggle and squiggle, and then they give up. So you don't lose many casualties. The Russians were a different fish. Sometimes they would surrender en masse. Sometimes they'd fight to the last guy, but generally speaking, when you surrounded, hundreds of thousands of Russians, there was going to be some fighting. And this would happen iteratively. And if there was a weak point in your net, if you'd cast a German net around this, and they found the weak point, they would hit it and hit it and hit it and hit it and hit it. And it didn't matter if they got out or not, because anybody that was there was going to suffer those casualties from all those hits. So to surround Soviets was different than surrounding Frenchmen or surrounding Belgians or surrounding Poles, because they kept fighting. Now, they'd lose lots of guys, but they would inflict casualties on you. And so this was something the Germans really didn't count on. They used their earlier experience and just projected it forward and said, everything will be like this, and no, it won't. Okay, so encirclement fight. So here's kind of what that looks like. You can see the kind of orangish dots, and those are all encirclements of Soviet troops, and I have a slide that'll show you kind of the numbers and some of the big ones, but what the Soviets are always trying to do here is they're on a piece of ground they think is valuable. Most of the orders coming from Moscow say, hold your ground and counterattack. Nobody ever says, hey, you're getting surrounded, back up. Nobody tells them that. And so they try to hold their ground to the point where they are stuck and they're surrounded, and then it becomes, a fight to the death. I'm surrounded and I can't get out, so now I'm going to kind of wiggle and squiggle and try, and I'm going to inflict some casualties, but at the end of the day, I'm dead. And so all of these dots are Soviet force encirclements, and I'll show you some of those numbers of what they look like. Let's see, there you go. Okay, so there's a few of them. Can you imagine a period of time in which a country is able to take losses of its troops of, what is that, 1, 2, 3, that's almost 3 million guys, right? That's within about 90 days. That's in about 90 days. Now, if you were the German army, you could assume, hey, if I could do this to somebody, I can beat them, right? Well, maybe so, maybe not. These losses are absorbed. And it isn't because it's easy to do, it's because one of the things that the Soviets had decided well before this war And this is kind of a philosophical thing. They decided that modern war is profoundly attritional. In other words, you lose guys, lots and lots of them. And so whatever force structure they designed for the Red Army, they thought in a war against a first-tier country like Germany, you would have to replace your entire force structure in 8 to 10 weeks. The whole thing, you'd have to replace it. And so they figured out what mechanisms you would have to have in place to replace your whole force structure in 8 to 10 weeks. And so that's why they trained 14.5 million reservists before there was a war, because their belief was modern war was so violent and casualties would mount so rapidly that if you didn't think about what happens after you lose everything, then you're going to lose. But if you can figure out how to reprime the pump, then you have a chance. And so the Soviets were able to absorb these losses, not gracefully and not with a whole bunch of fun, but more than probably anybody else in the world possibly could have done with a view to those numbers. Okay, there's more prisoners from Smolensk. By the way, what happens to these guys? Anybody know what happens to most of these guys? Yeah, they die. The German army has no logistical capability to take care of hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and they don't like them anyway. And so most of these guys, this is the late summer, early fall. By the next spring, the vast majority of them are dead. 6 out of every 10 of them are dead. Okay, so after a lot of these encirclement battles, at the end of August, there's an interesting dynamic that happens in the German command. The Germans are, they're mopping up, they're destroying lots of Soviet forces, they're making ground, they're headed towards Moscow, and a guy named Franz Halder, German general, chief of the German general staff, Franz Halder is interested in closing the deal, getting the German army to Moscow, surrounding it, and causing the final capitulation of the Soviet Union. But Adolf Hitler says, not so fast, because nowhere had Hitler ever acquiesced that Moscow was anything other than a city. It was a direction in which he was heading because the roads went there. And it was a direction in which he was heading because a lot of the Red Army was on that road, and he wanted to destroy that Red Army. But by the time he gets to the end of August, beginning of September, he's looking to the north and the south of the Moscow axis, and he's looking at Leningrad up north, and Leningrad is still hanging in there. It's a large city with an industrial capability, a large population, not surrounded, and Soviet force structure around it, and rails connecting it to things like the interior of Russia and seaports. And so he's interested in eradicating Leningrad as something that the Soviets can use. He looks south to Kiev, been in the news lately. And Kiev's a large city, also got an industrial base to it. Soviet army is in control of the area around Kiev relatively solidly. So all of the disasters that happened to the Soviet army, less of them happen in the south towards Kiev. More of them happen near Moscow and north. And so the Soviet forces in the south are in relatively good shape compared to everybody else. And Hitler looks at this and says, okay, first of all, this strength of the Soviets in the south and the strength of the Soviets in the north has to be ministered to first. So I'm going to spread my wealth, or I'm going to pull my armor out of Army Group Center. I'm going to send some of it up to Leningrad and some of it down to Kiev. And I'm going to deal with that. And that causes the German army, convulsions, because there's reasons why Moscow matters. Anybody imagine what they might be? I mean, there's certain population things, war production things, infrastructural things that are important to the Soviet war effort that are physically attached to the ground near Moscow, and you can't move them. And so rather than it just be a city or a place where Stalin lives or something like this, there's a lot of war capability that happens within 100 miles of the Kremlin. You draw a 100-mile circle around the Kremlin. There's a lot of magic that happens there. The roads and the rails come together like the middle of a spider's web there. If you take that, the rest of the Soviet Union loses its integrity. And so the German army is thinking, first of all, we want that. And second of all, if you want to kill the Red Army, head right for Moscow, because you know what? they'll put every last guy in front of you to try to stop you. And so you can kill them. Hitler's not interested in that, so he spreads them out north and south. As a result, there's about a month where you get absolutely no ground in the direction of Moscow. Now, the north and south thing don't work out badly. I mean, there's some benefit. 650,000 prisoners near Kiev, so that's nothing. That's not nothing. But at the same time, if you believe that the center of the Soviet war effort actually has something to do with Moscow, you're doing no positive work in that direction for about a month. That's a Soviet T-26 tank that got hit by something awful. And that's another one of those kind of interesting Soviet tanks. It's got a good gun on it, 45 millimeter anti-tank gun, but it's flimsy armor. It's one of those, flimsy armor tanks. So as a result, the Soviets have lots of those. When they get in action against the Germans, they tend to last not very long. Okay, so what is Typhoon? And by the way, if you look at all these slides, and I don't anticipate you sharpshooting me on this, but there's two different spellings of Typhoon. There's the German spelling and there's the English spelling, so this is the English spelling. Typhon, the German spelling, is in a few of my slides because I just left it in there because I felt like it. But in September, Hitler decides, okay, yeah, we're eventually going to have to go to Moscow. So he crafts a couple of directives that order the armor that he sent north and south to Leningrad and Kiev, respectively, to come back to Army Group Center. He then directs Army Group Center to launch a coherent offensive towards Moscow and to take the city. The way I told you he would want it taken earlier, i.e. surround it from the north and south, ring it so nothing gets in or out, and then kill the population using disease and starvation. This is really cool. Okay, so anyway, Typhoon effectively begins on the 2nd of October. The 2nd of October is a beautifully sunny, cool, crisp day, and all of the German armor that was nowhere near the Moscow axis roars into action, headed directly towards Moscow. So for the Germans, the 2nd of October is just a glorious day. We're on our way to Moscow, and nothing's going to stop us. When Typhoon starts, the operation against Moscow, these are the comparative strengths. And these are Army Group Center, which is headed directly to Moscow. And then there's three Soviet fronts, West Front, Bryansk Front, and Reserve Front, that are defending Moscow, and their combined strength is 1,250,000. The German attacking strength is 1,929,000. And that number is kind of deceptive because the German number includes a lot of auxiliaries. It includes the German Air Force that's located in that area. So not all of that is ground forces. The Soviet numbers are ground forces. The Germans are a whole bunch of strap hangers and their ground forces. So really what this is it's a one-to-one fight. Really nobody has a numerical advantage. It's the Germans who have they have a skill set advantage. They're better at mobile warfare than the Soviets are. But the Soviets are getting good at things like defense. Their defensive skills are getting better. So it's kind of a one-to-one fight, and you're pushing up against the Soviets' infrastructure, which means that their logistical problems are going to be less, whereas the Germans are pushing away from their logistical bases, so their logistical problems are going to be more. That German, by the way, was a guy who went to school in Leavenworth. He was let me go back to him. So Army Group Center's chief of operations, the chief of staff of Army Group Center. So it's the main German effort headed to Moscow. Their commander was a guy named Bach, Field Marshal Bach. He was the chief of staff, which meant he did most of the brain work about the operation. He went to school at Leavenworth in 1932-33. They sent him to Commander General Staff College at Leavenworth, Kansas. Then he comes back to the Third Reich. Actually, he doesn't get the full Leavenworth experience. He has to leave early because they have a big job for him. So anyway, this is what, by the way, that's the only senior German commander I can find that went to Leavenworth. That's a World War II guy, but he's a relatively significant guy. So this is what Typhoon looks like if you put it on a map. So you see Moscow, Moscow's up here. This is more or less the start line when Typhoon starts at the beginning of October. And then you get, 9th Army, which is primarily infantry, 3rd Panzer Army, 4th Panzer Army, 4th Army, 2nd Army. These ones that say Panzer Army, they have a lot of armored forces associated with them. The ones that are just regular armies, it's a lot of infantry, so less mobile, and all headed for Moscow. And you see that the distance between the start line and Moscow is relatively rapidly attained when you take a look at the cruddy weather that happens. And let me show you something about this weather thing. Okay, well, I get this cool picture first. As soon as before the Germans even start their move, the Soviets are planning to defend Moscow, and this is literally all of the women in Moscow, because all of the guys are wearing some kind of a uniform, carrying some kind of a rifle, and most of the female population of Moscow is digging 3 semicircular concentric rings of anti-tank ditches around the city to keep the Germans out. And this is just an example of what part of one of those 3 anti-tank ditches, and they go 3/4 of the way around the city. There's 3, one inside the other, to prevent German ingress of armored vehicles towards Moscow. The Germans, by the way, see this from aircraft, and they can't believe it. They photograph it, and they bring the photographs home, and nobody can believe it. It's like, where'd these giant anti-tank ditches coming from? Well, take a look at the photo. Okay, this is a terrible eye chart for you, but it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing if you're me, because I can get close to it. One of the things to notice, this is Soviet rail networks. When you take Moscow, which is right here, most of the Soviet rail network becomes discontinuous. There's no way to link. Their natural resources come from several different places. Their oil comes from down here. Their coal and iron ore come from here. Their aluminum comes from out here. And when you take those things apart and you can't move them, you're going to lose the ability to conduct modern war because you can't get the resources where they need to go. When the Germans, by the way, get into this area, iron ore and coal supply to the Red Army almost drops off to zero. I mean, literally, there's a month where not a pound of coal is mined in the Soviet Union and is supplied to the war effort. There's a problem with oil supply being down here. If you cut the rail network or you cut the Volga River, later in 1942, they're going to try to cut the Volga River. But this is where all the oil comes from. How do you conduct modern war without oil? And the hub of all of those transportation nodes is Moscow. So Moscow is important for a lot of reasons. So let's see what the next slide is. Who can imagine? Okay, so there we go. So this is 1941 resource production, millions of tons, in millions of tons. The red numbers are Soviet and the blue numbers are German. And you can see the Germans produce a heck of a lot of coal compared to the Soviets. And they produce a heck of a lot of steel compared to the Soviets. And really where the Soviets have an advantage is oil production. And that basic equation shows you something about the Allied alliance in World War II. When you have Americans and British producing things that are made out of steel and shipping them to the Soviet Union, it alleviates some of this problem with not having enough steel. The Soviets are not blessed with all the natural resources in the world, to dispel one myth that they just have tremendous amounts of resources. No, really, they get more oil than the Germans, but in other categories, it ain't so great. Okay, so Typhoon starts on the 2nd of October. Beautiful day, beautiful day. On the 6th of October, it starts to rain. And I don't know if you can see that picture, but those guys got to be hating life. There's like 100 Germans there pulling a car, and the road behind it is just a mud rut. I got a couple other pictures of this mud too, but what is this going to do to the speed of Typhoon headed to Moscow? Okay, so if you're the Soviets and you need some time to kind of recobble a defense, this is relatively helpful, isn't it? And so this lasts for about a month. This kind of miserable weather condition, the roadlessness, lasts for about a month. I think I have a couple of quick pictures to show you that are okay. So here's some unfortunate horses, and it's terrible to be that horse. But most of the German logistical traffic is pulled by horse. The Germans have a mechanized army, but what that means is about 20% of their forces are actually mechanized, and 80% are like they were in World War I. The guys walk on their feet. The logistics and the artillery are pulled by horses, and the general might have a staff car. And that's 80% of the truth with the German army. And it's most of the truth with the Russian army, too, although the Russians are producing more and more and more. And so as the war goes further and further and further, their percentage of mechanization goes up. The Germans never get past 20%.
Is it like this every October? I mean, is this an annual thing?
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, this is an interesting thing. It's like, oh my goodness, it gets cold in Russia in the winter. Who would have thunk? Yeah, this happens every year. And the term Rasputitsa, the roadlessness, it's a term. It's like, hey, it's tornadoes. Okay, we're in Kansas. It's the tornado season. It happens every year. So the Germans and the older Germans, the guys that are generals, a lot of them had experience with the Eastern Front in World War I. So why did these guys not remember that it gets like this? Well, one of the things is they thought that by this time, by October, it'd be over. So, and this is the same thing with winter coats. It's not like the Germans don't know what a winter coat is, but if all of your trains moving east are full of ammo and fuel because you need every bit of it you can ship, how many winter coats do you think you're putting on those trains? And it's zero. And of course, the reason it's okay for it to be zero is because that by the time you need the coats, the fighting's over. So I won't have to send all this ammo and fuel and stuff. I'll just send some coats. So that's going to bite them in the butt a little bit later on. But and this logistical thing too. You would not believe how many things you don't think about when you don't think about them. The horses used, so the cart is called a panja cart. And these little lightweight horses are Russian indigenous horses. And the dynamic here is they don't pull very much. They're not very strong, they're not very big. They can't pull very much. And so a German might look at them and say, not much of a horse. German horses, the peacetime German army, German horses that they go to war with, are big horses. They're big horses. And they pull these really cool metal wagons with articulated suspensions. And it's very German. It's very sophisticated for a wagon. And they're expensive and everything else. But when you get them to Russia, there's a strange thing that begins to happen. A German horse, now horses are not political, right? A German horse gets fed a high-protein diet. So it's the right kind of food for the right kind of horse. You want a big, strong horse, you feed it a certain kind of food. You feed it so much a day. German horses get Sundays off. So the German army works 6 days a week, Sundays off. So the horse knows the contract, right? You get fed good, you pull hard, you get Sunday off. When you take these horses to Russia and you can't feed them that high-quality German fodder and you can't give them Sundays off, they do the only thing that a horse can do to show you that it is displeased. They die. I've had it. You voided the contract. I'm dying. And so in the summer, you actually have German soldiers, their infantry, pulling those big articulated wagons full of all the junk that the dead horses can't pull. And then later on, you go to, let's use the little Russian horses, because the Russian horses can eat the indigenous fodder in Russia. They don't mind eating the grass or whatever it is, and they're little, so it works, but you can't pull much.
Is that this photograph and the one before it with the folks
The car?
The car. There's nothing behind it. Are the Germans marching through all that stuff too, or are the Germans going a different direction on trucks and cars and so forth?
Most German infantry, once it gets off a train, and the units that start the war on foot, crossing the border on foot, most of those walk the whole war. They walk the whole war, which it can be a morale buster. You know, if anybody been in the infantry, you know that walking a long distance can be a downer. But if you know there's an end to it, okay, maybe I can handle this. In Russia, the terrain never seems to end. You know, it goes on forever. There's no end in sight for the war. The enemy's not quitting. You kill him in large numbers, and the next day, guess what? He's back. You know, they keep showing up. So the German army really begins to have a problem with melancholy. That's a good word, isn't it? You know, guys kind of going to the doctor saying, you know, I feel terribly depressed. Well, you know what? You're in Russia. Of course you're going to be depressed. Okay, so some of the effects of mud, negative effects on the German army in Operation Typhoon. Of course, the maneuver is slowed for a lot of different reasons. It limits your cross-country movement. You know, the roads are miserable, but going cross-country is even worse, which allows the Soviets to block you on a road because you can no longer get around him if he tries to block you. You know, that maneuver around him, it's impassable. The weather conditions have turned the ground into muck, and you can't maneuver in it. So now the Soviets have a better defensive capability. Your logistics are choked because of, you know, the lack of utility of the roads to move your logistics. Guys are getting sick because it's so wet, they're soaked through, and so you're starting to get a lot of trench foot and a lot of these other diseases as well as kind of respiratory diseases because it's so wet. Reduced volume and effects of artillery. Okay, so if you can't move a lot of artillery ammo because it's heavy and you have to move it on trucks, which means it has to move on roads, and you can't use the roads, even if you have your artillery with you, it might have a few rounds it can fire, but it can't lather somebody with fire. So you still have these big guns, but they don't have much ammo with them. So the way the Germans make war is compromised by all of this weather stuff that they never thought about because they thought the war would be over by the time this weather dynamic kicked in. Okay, and so if the muddy season was bad, then we have kind of a moment of relief. Ah, thank goodness, the freeze. And so you get this freeze dynamic, which actually when it happens, the Germans are elated. Thank goodness, the mud is gone. But if you can imagine these muddy rut roads, okay, with these really deep valleys, these troughs in the mud, when that freezes hard, okay, how is it to drive a motor vehicle on that? And so what you find is even when the ground is hard, you know, it's better for a track vehicle like a tank, because a tank's going to have fun on a solid surface. But something like a truck with regular tires and a regular suspension that's designed to operate in Western Europe, when it's in these kind of frozen mud ruts, it's going to be breaking its suspension. It's going to be having all kinds of different problems, different ones in the muddy season, but problems. These guys, so this is Moscow. This is the 7th of November, 1941. These guys are having the Revolution Day parade. So, you know, the October Revolution, which happens in November because the calendar changes. You're familiar with that, right? So the October Revolution, which happens in 1917, and then after the Revolution, they adjust the calendar so it matches everybody else's calendar. And so the October Revolution actually happens in November. Okay, you know something you didn't know before. So anyway, that's the day they normally have the big military parade to commemorate the revolution. And those guys are going directly from the parade to the front. So Lenin's tomb is in the background. You see the little guys up on top. Stalin's one of those guys up on top. He's kind of saluting and waving and shaking his hand and saying, have a good time. And they're going to march directly to the front. Those are workers' militia, which means they have no military training. They're just guys. You dragoon them, you give them a gun, off we go.
What are they carrying on their shoulders?
those are actually British Lewis guns. Who the heck knows where the Red Army got a bunch of British Lewis guns? I think they probably came from the World War I supply to the Tsar's army, and they were probably in storage because the Russians actually do not make ammunition for that kind of a gun. And so when you need to fight the Germans and you don't have anything else, give them the Lewis guns. And one can only wonder how many rounds of ammunition these guys have, and when they run out, where they're going to get a few more. Because it's in British .303 caliber, not available in the Soviet Union as far as I know in 1941, so maybe these guys have, you know, some ammo. They won't get any more anytime soon. Let's see, one more picture. So that's Lenin's tomb. Anybody been to Moscow? It's still there. Lenin's still in it. Actually, he took a vacation in 1941. He took a vacation. He went to Kubyshev, I think. They shipped him out because they didn't want the Germans to capture his corpse, because that would be the end of days. And so he spent some time in a warehouse where some mice ate part of his fingers. But yeah, anyway, that's not visible anymore. They did a great job putting a glove on it. Anyway, Stalin is up here. You can actually, let me see, right there, that's Stalin. And he's saying hello to now those guys are regular infantry. That's regular Soviet infantry. But they're going the same place. It's a cold day, and they're going right from that parade right to the front. Okay, so talked about this a little bit earlier, but there's just some statistics for you. So what's happening to the Soviet Union's ability to produce war material between June and November? So there's your statistics for you. And then at the bottom there in red, overall ability to produce stuff in general that supports the war effort is dropped by 60%. So, sir.
Is this the big reason we had to send in Dodges and Studebakers and airplanes and tanks?
Was it Avril Harriman, I think, is the guy who goes over to get the shopping list from Stalin. And Stalin gives him a $1 billion shopping list of what the Soviet armed forces, what the Soviet Union needs. And there's, yeah, trucks, Studebaker trucks, all that other kind of stuff. Yes. They need all that stuff. Stalin actually makes some interesting speeches right in this period where, you know, he very publicly states that the alliance between the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain, that alliance is the guarantor of victory. So he spends some time not saying it's just us. He actually publicly states that the alliance with the United States and Great Britain and the Soviet Union together is the thing that will guarantee the defeat of Hitler. And so he does kind of give credit where credit is due publicly for something that he does desperately need, which is all this, you know, support from the West. Okay, let's see what else we have here for you. Okay, Soviet force generation. So if they can't produce anything anymore, what is it that they still can produce? And one of the things that they can do is they can still generate force structure. They still have human beings. And this is kind of a bloodthirsty way of putting this, but when you actually cannot make the machines of war anymore, but you still want to fight, the only way to stop the other guy is using flesh and blood. And that's what they do. The Soviet army in the period, the end of 1941 through the middle of 1942, is relatively equipment poor and relatively manpower rich. And so just by shoving flesh and blood at the enemy, you can slow him down. And it isn't until the later part of the war where the Soviet Union gets better with the mechanical part. They have enough, what do I got? 25 minutes left? 35 minutes left? 5 minutes left. Okay. Okay, so here you go. The 13 new armies, 6 of them go to Moscow, 5 of them in November, 5 of those in November, December.
Is this when Zhukov comes from the east?
Zhukov is actually in and out of Moscow for the whole war, but he's sent, he is in Moscow in November. And you know, Zhukov is the most famous Soviet general of the war, probably the best Soviet general of the war, most capable Soviet general of the war, and he's really in charge of the overall defense of Moscow with some other guys who were pretty good too. So when you see what happened to the Soviets, this is kind of what has happened to the Germans at the same time. From June to November, they've lost 686,000 men. And that accounts for 20%. For every German soldier, every 100 German soldiers that were sent to the east, 20 of them are already down. And this is within 6 months. This is within 5 months. A third of their motor vehicles are lost forever. A third of their motor vehicles are damaged, not fully capable. A third of them are fully capable. And at the bottom there, the Germans have 136 divisions in Russia, but when you look at the manpower losses, the strength of them is only the strength of 83 full-strength ones. So the Germans are having some problems too. That's an ad for sending books to the front for German soldiers to read. Soviet counteroffensive, and this is really the end. Thank goodness, because I'm out of time. Soviet tanks getting ready to launch counteroffensive. So what happens is the Germans themselves on the 5th of December are screaming to be told to stop. They're out of guys. Soviet resistance is not crumbling. It's getting cold as heck. I've got a slide with the temperature just to give you a feel for this. And German commanders are already saying, we need to stop, we need to stop, we need to stop. And on the 5th of December, the Soviets launch a massive counteroffensive, which pushes the German army back on both sides of Moscow about 20 to 30 miles relatively quickly, and then further than that a little bit later on. So that effectively ends Typhoon. The Germans culminate. They can't go any further. The weather kicks in. The Germans are at the end of their strength, and then the Soviets, who have been saving up for some kind of either a defense or a big fight, launch it into a counteroffensive and push the Germans back. Okay, so let me see if I can zip through the last. There's a picture of some Soviets moving forward through Moscow. That's suburbs of Moscow in the background. Temperatures. So between the 4th and 7th of December, the average temperature is 37 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Germans are having problems with weather-related casualties. Their lubricants freezing, their artillery stops working. German aircraft, which have to operate in fields, in these freezing cold fields, have a very low rate of utility. You got to heat up the oil and all that other stuff. Soviet aircraft that are running out of Moscow have heated hangars, concrete runways, because it's Moscow. And all this stuff is there because it's Moscow. And so, for once, Soviet aircraft have a higher availability rate than German aircraft. Ski troops and T-26. Okay, so there's some casualties. I'm almost done, so we'll ask a few questions. May 1941 is the last month that the Germans are not engaged in the Soviet Union. And in the rest of Europe, they lose 2,800 guys killed. As soon as June 1941 happens, 22,000. And of course, that's only a week, because the war starts on the 22nd of June. So that's only a week's worth of casualties in Russia. Okay, so I've expended every bit of time I possibly could.
Okay, so we have time for one question, because
Oh,
catering is already here, so we have to get out of the room.
Make it a good one.
I should know this, but I don't remember the Soviet loss of manpower in this particular battle.
Soviet losses up until, let's say, the 5th of December, so up until their counteroffensive, and this is killed, wounded, captured, is 4 million. So a tremendous amount of Soviet force structure is wiped off the map, but they're not dead yet. Till about the 1st of November, they've already lost about 4 million.
Okay, and I'm very sorry, but we do have another event, and so we need to clear the room. You're welcome to, yes, please.